The thunder didn't just roll across the plains, it cracked the sky in half. And in that flash of jagged light, Porter Ingram saw her. She was slumped against his barn wall, a ghost soaked to the bone. Her belly was swollen with child, a fact so obvious it was like a second heartbeat in the storm. This was 1878, 3 years to the day since Porter had buried his own wife, his own infant son. 3 years of silence on a ranch 10 miles from nowhere in the Wyoming Territory. He hadn't expected to see another living soul out here, least of all a woman who looked like she was carrying all the world's sorrows. Tears and rain cut paths down her pale face. She was drowning on dry land. Porter swung down from his horse, the leather groaning in protest. He moved slow, hands where she could see them. A man alone out here was either a survivor or a predator, and he knew which one he looked like. "Madam," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Are you hurt?" She flinched like a startled deer, pressing herself into the wet, weathered wood of the barn. Her eyes were huge, filled with a terror that wasn't just about the storm. She was scanning his face, looking for the monster she was so clearly running from. She couldn't have been more than 20. Copper hair, dark with rain, was plastered to her skin. "I'm not going to harm you," Porter said, a little softer this time. He took off his hat, holding it over his chest like a shield. "My name's Porter Ingram. This is my land." The woman's lips trembled. "I'm sorry for trespassing, sir. I needed a place to rest." His eyes took in the rest of her story. The dress torn at the hem and stained with mud. The boots worn through at the soles. And the small oilcloth bundle she clutched under one arm, holding it like it was the last thing she had left in the world. She wasn't just resting. She was hiding. "You're welcome inside," he heard himself say. "Storm's only getting worse." He pointed toward the house, a simple two-story box he'd built with his own two hands, a monument to a life that had ended before it began. "There's food, dry clothes that might fit you." She hesitated. Her hand went to her belly, a gesture both protective and defiant. "Why would you help a stranger?" The question hit him right in the chest, right in that hollowed-out place where his heart used to be. 3 years ago, his Elizabeth would have dragged the woman inside without a second thought. Elizabeth believed in kindness. Porter just believed in survival. "Because no one should be alone in a storm," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Especially not in your condition." She watched him for a long moment, her eyes searching for the lie. When she didn't find one, she gave a weak, exhausted nod. "Thank you, I'm Tessa. Tessa Sanders." Porter reached out to help her up, and he felt her wince, a sharp intake of breath as she put weight on her leg. He saw the dark stains spreading on her torn dress, just above the knee. It wasn't mud, it was blood. "Miss Sanders," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You're hurt." She tried to pull away, a fresh wave of panic in her eyes. "It's nothing. I fell." But Porter had been a soldier in the war. He knew the difference between a scrape and a wound. He'd seen enough men lie about their injuries until it was too late. He wasn't about to let that happen again. Without another word, he scooped her up into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. He could feel the fragile bones beneath her wet clothes, the frantic beat of her heart against his chest. She cried out, a small sound of protest, but she was too weak to fight. "You didn't just fall," he said, his voice grim as he carried her toward the house, shielding her from the driving rain with his own body. "Someone did this to you." He didn't wait for an answer. He already knew. The fear in her eyes wasn't just from a drifter who'd abandoned her. It was the fear of a woman who knew she was being hunted, and he had just invited the hunt to his front door. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace was a welcome shock. Porter set Tessa down gently in the big armchair, the one Elizabeth had loved. He stoked the fire, the flames leaping up, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The shadows looked like they were reaching for her. "I'll get my wife's clothes," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The word wife felt foreign now, a ghost on his tongue. "Then I'm looking at that leg." Tessa's eyes softened, a flicker of gratitude in their frightened depths. "I'm sorry about your wife." Porter just nodded, the old ache twisting inside him. 3 years now, childbed fever, took her and our boy. Her hand flew to her belly. Fear, raw and immediate, flashed across her face. He saw it then. It wasn't just the birth she was afraid of. It was surviving it. He regretted his words instantly. There's stew on the stove. Help yourself. He turned and went upstairs, needing the space as much as she did. He was a fool for mentioning it, for bringing his own tragedy into this room. He came back down with a simple wool dress and a heavy shawl. Tessa hadn't moved. She hadn't touched the stew. She was just staring into the fire, fresh tears carving clean lines through the grime on her cheeks. "Miss Sanders," he said, kneeling beside her chair. "Tessa, talk to me." She shook her head, a choked sob escaping her lips. "I have nowhere to go. No one." This was the story she had prepared, the one she thought he would believe. "My parents disowned me. The baby's father, he promised to marry me. Then he vanished." Porter's jaw tightened. It was a common enough tale, a cruel one, but it wasn't the whole story. He could feel it. The wound on her leg wasn't part of that story. "Who was he, Tessa?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "The baby's father." She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "His name was James. He worked at my father's store for a spell. He was handsome, charming." Her voice hardened. "A liar." "Where were you headed?" "Denver. My aunt lives there. But I ran out of money in town. The stagecoach wouldn't take me." She finally looked up at him, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't just shame. It was a fierce, desperate plea. "I'm not what you think I am, Mr. Ingram." "Never thought you were," he answered, and it was the honest truth. "You can stay here tonight. Rest. But we need to clean and bind that wound." He fetched the medical kit he kept from his army days. As he gently rolled up the ragged hem of her dress, he saw the injury clearly for the first time. It wasn't a clean wound. It was a deep, ragged gash, already inflamed at the edges. It looked like she'd been grazed by a bullet. His blood ran cold. This changed everything. This wasn't a family dispute. This was something far more dangerous. "Tessa," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "this isn't from a fall." She started to cry in earnest then, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. "He found me," she whispered, the words tumbling out between gasps. "I thought I'd lost him outside of town. He cornered me by the creek. Said I couldn't run from him." "James?" Porter asked, his hands pausing as he cleaned the wound. She shook her head violently. "No, not James. His brother, Thomas." Porter froze. Thomas. She had mentioned a Thomas before. The local banker's son. The man she was supposed to marry before the drifter James swept her off her feet. "The man you were betrothed to?" he asked, his mind racing. "Why would he shoot you?" "Because of what I took," she choked out, her hand instinctively clutching the oilcloth bundle that now lay on the floor beside her chair. "It wasn't James who stole $50 from my father's till. It was me. And it wasn't $50. She looked at him, her eyes wild with fear, in a strange kind of triumph. "It was 5,000 and a ledger." Porter felt the floor drop out from under him. $5,000 in 1878 was a fortune. And a ledger meant secrets, records, proof. She hadn't just run away from home. She had stolen the key to a man's ruin. Not a drifter's. A banker's son. A man with power, with influence. A man who would send people to hunt her down and take back what was his. A man who wouldn't be stopped by a lonely ranch at the edge of the world. The storm outside wasn't the only one that was coming. A far deadlier one was heading straight for them, and he was standing right in its path. "Mr. Ingram," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He said he'd kill me. He said he'd cut the baby out of me to get that ledger back." Porter finished bandaging her leg, his movements steady and sure, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting in his mind. He had offered a stranger shelter from a storm. Now he was sheltering a fugitive with a price on her head and on her child's. He looked at her, this terrified girl who had stumbled into his broken life, and he saw the ghost of his wife, the memory of his son. He had failed to protect them. He wouldn't fail again. "You'll rest now," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He helped her up the stairs to the small bedroom, the one that should have been his son's. He settled her into the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. "Mr. Ingram," she said, stopping him at the door. "Why? After what I told you, why are you still helping me?" Porter looked back at her, at the fear and the fight warring in her eyes. He thought of the man named Thomas, a man who would threaten a woman and her unborn child. He thought of the empty quiet of his own life. "Because some men need to be shown what real protection looks like," he said. He closed the door behind him, but he didn't go downstairs. He went to his own room and opened the old dusty trunk at the foot of his bed. Beneath his winter wools and a faded photograph of Elizabeth, his fingers found the cold, familiar weight of his old service revolver. He checked the action. It was clean, oiled, ready. Downstairs, the fire crackled. Outside, the thunder growled, closer now. He had invited her in to save her from the storm. Now he had to save her from the men who were riding on its heels. The night was long. Every crash of thunder sounded like a gunshot. Every gust of wind against the windows sounded like a hand trying the latch. Porter didn't sleep. He sat in the dark living room, revolver across his lap, listening. He was a soldier again, on watch, waiting for an enemy he couldn't see. He thought about Tessa upstairs, a girl who looked so fragile but had the nerve to steal a fortune and a book of secrets from a powerful man. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. She had just run out of places to fight. Just before dawn, the storm broke. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It felt heavy, expectant. A loud clap of thunder, one last defiant roar from the departing storm, shook the house. It was followed by a sharp, terrified cry from upstairs. Porter was moving before he even thought about it, taking the stairs two at a time. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open. Tessa was sitting bolt upright in bed, clutching the quilt to her chest. She was wearing one of Elizabeth's old nightgowns, and for a heart-stopping second, it was like seeing a ghost. "The storm," she stammered, her eyes wide. "I thought—" "It's all right," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "It's passing." Another, more distant rumble of thunder made her jump. He saw her whole body tremble. He stepped into the room, a silent offer of comfort. Would you mind staying? Just for a little while?" she asked, her voice small, stripped of the fire she'd shown earlier. He nodded, taking the old rocking chair by the window. He could see the first pale light of dawn breaking over the wet, clean-swept prairie. It looked peaceful. A lie. "Tell me about him," Porter said into the quiet room. "Thomas, the man you were supposed to marry." Tessa hugged her knees to her chest. "Thomas Holloway. His father owns the bank, the general store, half the town of Cypress Creek. My father is in his debt. The marriage was a business arrangement." Holloway, the name clicked. Agatha Holloway, the sharp-tongued widow who ran the boarding house, the self-appointed moral guardian of the town, his mother most likely. It was all starting to make sense. The town wasn't just unfriendly, it was compromised. "Thomas is cruel," Tessa whispered. "He likes to hurt things that are smaller than him. Animals, people. He thought he would own me. When I met James, I saw a way out." "James was his brother?" Porter asked, trying to fit the pieces together. Tessa laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "No, that's the part I didn't understand until it was too late. James wasn't his brother. He was his employee. Thomas hired him to seduce me." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Porter felt a cold fury rise in him. "Why?" "To ruin me," she said, her voice flat and dead. "To prove to my father that I was worthless, damaged goods. So my father would be so ashamed, so grateful for Thomas's offer to marry me anyway, that he would sign over the deed to our family's land. The last thing Thomas's father doesn't own." It was a trap, a sick, twisted game played by a man with too much power and no soul. "But you fell for James," Porter stated. "I thought I did," she corrected. "He was kind. He told me about his dreams of going west, of starting fresh. When I told him I was pregnant, he looked so happy. He said we would leave together." That night, her voice broke. "The next morning he was gone, and Thomas came to my window. He was smiling. He told me the game was over and that I had lost. But she hadn't lost. She'd raised the stakes." "That's when you took the ledger," Porter guessed. She nodded. I knew Thomas kept it in his father's office at the bank. He was careless, arrogant. He bragged about it. All the dirty secrets of everyone in Cypress Creek. Every loan, every debt, every bit of blackmail that kept the Holloways in power. I knew it was the only thing that could protect me. The only thing Thomas feared more than his father. She had walked into the lion's den and stolen its teeth. So I took it, and the cash box. I knew I would need money to disappear. But she hadn't disappeared. She'd run right into another man's life. His life. They sat in silence as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fragile pink. He learned that her leg was throbbing, that she hadn't eaten in 2 days, that the baby inside her was the only reason she hadn't laid down in the rain and given up. As the light filled the room, chasing the last of the shadows away, Porter made a decision. It was reckless. It was insane. It was the only thing that made sense. Denver is not an option anymore, he said, his voice firm. Thomas will have men watching the roads, the stagecoach lines. You'll never make it. Panic flared in her eyes again. But what do? I can't stay here. He'll bring this all down on you. Let him try, Porter said, the words coming out like cold iron. He stood up and walked to the door. We're going to tell a new story, you and I. A simpler one. One that even the Holloways will have to accept. What story? She whispered. Porter paused at the door and looked back at her. The story of a lonely widower who took himself a wife. A pregnant widow whose husband died on the trail west. Tessa stared at him, her mouth agape. You would marry me? A stranger? Knowing all this? I know you're carrying a child that needs a father. I know you're being hunted by a man who deserves to be put in the ground. I know this ranch is the safest place for you right now, and the only way to make it truly safe is to give you my name. He took a breath. This isn't about love, Tessa. It's about survival. Theirs and ours. He was offering her a shield, a fortress, his name, and in return she was bringing a war into his home, a war he hadn't asked for, but that he now found himself ready to fight. They'll never believe it, she said, her voice full of doubt. They will, Porter countered, because we will make them. We'll ride into town tomorrow. We'll get supplies. We'll announce our intentions to the circuit preacher. We'll do it all out in the open. The Holloways are powerful because of secrets and shadows. We're going to fight them with daylight. A flicker of hope ignited in Tessa's eyes, the first he had seen since she'd arrived. You really think it could work? I think, Porter said, his hand resting on the butt of the revolver tucked into his belt, that Thomas Holloway is about to find out he picked a fight with the wrong man. That day, a strange and fragile alliance was forged. They were no longer just a rancher and a fugitive. They were partners, co-conspirators. He worked on fixing a loose wagon wheel, his movements deliberate, his mind already mapping out the days ahead. She insisted on helping, hobbling around the kitchen, her bandaged leg a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the horizon. She baked bread, and the smell filled the house, a scent of home that Porter hadn't realized he'd missed so badly. They spoke little, but the silence was different now. It was filled with unspoken understanding. They were two broken people, pushed together by a storm, now lashing themselves together to face the hurricane they knew was coming. That evening they sat on the porch. The air was cool and clean after the rain. He won't just let this go, Tessa said quietly, staring out at the vast empty prairie. Thomas, you don't understand what he's like. When he wants something, he takes it, and he believes I belong to him. No one belongs to anyone, Porter replied, his voice a low growl. Where is the ledger now? Tessa patted the small oilcloth bundle that she never let out of her sight. Here, I wrapped it to keep it from the rain. We need to hide it, Porter said. Somewhere he'll never think to look. Somewhere safe. He led her into the barn, the scent of hay and horses filling the air. He walked to the back, to the stall that had once belonged to his old mare Daisy, who had died the same winter as Elizabeth. He knelt down and prized up a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a small, dark space. My father taught me to always have a bolt hole, he said, a place for things you can't afford to lose. Tessa hesitated for only a second before placing the bundle into the dark space. As Porter replaced the floorboard, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders, but another heavier one settled onto his. He was the keeper of her secret now, her protector. The next morning they rode into Cypress Creek. The town was just a handful of dusty buildings huddled together against the vastness of the prairie. But as they drove the wagon down the main street, Porter felt 100 eyes on them. He felt Tessa tense beside him, pulling her borrowed shawl tighter. "Head up," he said quietly. "Look them in the eye. We have nothing to be ashamed of." Their first stop was Whitaker's General Store. As Porter helped Tessa down from the wagon, he saw the curtain twitch in the window of the boarding house across the street. Agatha Holloway was watching. Inside the store, the whispers started immediately. Mrs. Whitaker's face was a mask of polite curiosity, but her eyes darted from Tessa's belly to Porter's grim face. "Mr. Ingram," she greeted, "and Miss Sanders. We heard you'd left town." "Her plans changed," Porter said smoothly, placing a protective hand on the small of Tessa's back. "She's decided to stay as my wife." The store went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Mrs. Whitaker's jaw literally fell open. Before she could recover, the door creaked open and a man stepped inside. He was handsome, well-dressed, with pale, cold eyes that seemed to suck the warmth out of the room. He looked at Tessa, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice silky and laced with menace. "Look what the storm washed in. I was so worried about you, my dear." It was Thomas Holloway. Tessa froze, all the color draining from her face. Porter stepped slightly in front of her, shielding her from Thomas's predatory gaze. "She's with me now, Holloway," Porter said, his voice level and cold. Thomas's eyes flickered to Porter, dismissing him in an instant. "I believe you have something that belongs to my family, Tessa. A small misunderstanding, I'm sure. Why don't you come with me and we can clear it all up?" He took a step forward. Porter didn't move, but his presence was a solid wall. "She's not going anywhere with you." Thomas's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. He finally seemed to see Porter for the first time. "And who are you? Some broken-down farmer playing hero?" "I'm the man she's going to marry," Porter said, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "And I'm telling you to back away from my fiancée." The air crackled with tension. Thomas looked from Porter's stony face to Tessa's terrified one. He saw the defiance there, the unexpected lifeline she had found. His eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. "You're making a very big mistake, farmer," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "And you," Porter countered, "have no idea how far I'll go to protect what's mine." Thomas held his gaze for a long moment. A silent battle of wills fought in the middle of the general store. Then he laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "We'll see," he said, before turning on his heel and stalking out of the store. The moment he was gone, Tessa sagged against Porter, her legs threatening to give out. He held her steady, his arm a band of iron around her. They bought their supplies in silence, the eyes of the other customers burning into their backs. As they left, Porter glanced across the street. Standing on the boardwalk in front of the bank was Thomas, talking to two rough-looking men. Men Porter didn't recognize. Men who wore their guns tied low on their hips. They weren't ranchers. They were hired muscle. The threat was no longer veiled. It was standing in the broad daylight, watching them. On the ride back to the ranch, Tessa was quiet, her hands twisted in her lap. "I've doomed you," she finally whispered, her voice thick with despair. "He'll send those men after us. He'll burn your ranch to the ground to get what he wants." "He can try," Porter said, his knuckles white as he gripped the reins. He wasn't a young man anymore. He had aches in his bones and ghosts in his heart. But the soldier inside him, the man who had survived the horrors of war, was waking up, and he was not afraid of a spoiled banker's son. "He thinks I'm just a farmer," Porter said, a grim smile touching his lips. "He's about to be very surprised." That night, the house didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a fort, an outpost on the edge of a war zone. After their meager supper, Porter didn't sit on the porch. He retrieved a rifle from his late father's gun cabinet, a heavy, long-barreled Winchester. He took it outside and began to clean it by the light of a lantern. Tessa came out and stood watching him, a silhouette in the doorway. "You've done this before," she stated. It wasn't a question. For 4 years, he answered without looking up. I saw things. Did things I've spent the last decade trying to forget. He finished with the rifle and looked up at her, his face hard in the lantern light. Tomorrow I'm going to teach you how to shoot. Her eyes widened. Me? I've never even held a gun. Then it's time you learned, he said. Thomas Holloway isn't going to play by any rules. Neither can we. The next few days were a blur of tension and preparation. Every morning, Porter took her out to a secluded part of the ranch and taught her how to handle a pistol, one of his old Army Colts. At first, her hands shook, the weight of the gun unnatural and terrifying. But Porter was patient. He showed her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing. Don't think of it as a weapon, he told her. Think of it as a key. It's the key to your survival, to our child's survival. Something hardened in her then. The fear was replaced by a cold, fierce determination. She stopped flinching at the recoil. Her shots, while still wild, began to cluster closer to the tin cans he set up on a fence post. They fell into a new rhythm. By day they worked. They prepared. They fortified. Porter boarded up a back window, checked the hinges on all the doors. Tessa organized their supplies, making sure they had enough food and water to last a siege. They were a team, united by a common threat. At night they talked. He told her about Elizabeth, about the dreams they'd had for the ranch, for their son. She told him about her childhood, about the suffocating smallness of Cypress Creek and her desperation for a different life. They were filling in the empty spaces of each other's pasts, building a bridge of trust over a river of fear. One evening, as they were cleaning the weapons by the fire, Tessa looked at him, her expression serious. Porter, she said, there's something else about the ledger. It's not just about the townspeople's debts. He waited, sensing this was important. Thomas and his father, they've been using the bank to launder money for an outlaw gang, the Blackwood Boys. They've been hitting trains and banks up in Montana, and the Holloways have been washing the gold, taking a cut. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It's all in there. Dates, amounts, names. This was bigger than blackmail. This was a federal crime. This was the kind of secret that didn't just get you killed, it got you erased. James, Porter said, the name tasting like poison. Was he one of them? Tessa nodded, her eyes full of a deep old pain. He was their scout, their pretty face. He'd go into towns, get the lay of the land, find the weaknesses. He played me. He played everyone. But I think a small part of him really did want to get away, to be someone else. But he was too scared of them. And Thomas? Thomas isn't just their banker. He wants to be one of them. He's reckless, vicious. He thinks it makes him a big man. She shivered. That's who's coming for us, Porter. Not just a rich boy's thugs. He'll bring the whole gang down on us if he has to. The stakes had just been raised again. This wasn't a local feud anymore. They were caught in the middle of a war between greed and lawlessness, and they were on their own. 3 days later, the circuit preacher arrived in Cypress Creek. As they'd planned, Porter and Tessa rode into town to meet him. The air was thick with unspoken hostility. Thomas Holloway stood on the steps of the bank, flanked by his 2 hired guns, watching their every move. He didn't smile this time. His face was a mask of cold hatred. The ceremony was in the small, dusty church. It was short and simple. The preacher, a tired-looking man named Reverend Johnson, seemed eager to get it over with. The only witnesses were Dr. Farley and his wife, a kind couple who had always treated Porter with respect. As Porter slipped a simple gold band, his mother's, onto Tessa's finger, he looked into her eyes. He saw fear there, yes, but he also saw trust. He saw a flicker of something more, something that felt dangerously like hope. He had married her to protect her. But as he looked at his wife, he felt a fierce, unexpected wave of possession. She was his. Her child was his. And he would burn the world down to keep them safe. As they left the church, now husband and wife, one of Thomas's thugs stepped into their path. Mr. Holloway wants a word, the man grunted. Porter pushed Tessa gently behind him. Tell him I have nothing to say. He said you'd say that, the man sneered, and spat a wad of tobacco near Tessa's feet. He also said to give you this, a wedding present. He tossed something at Porter's chest. Porter caught it instinctively. It was a child's wooden toy, a small carved horse, identical to the one he had carved for his own son, the one he had buried with him. Rage, pure and blinding, ripped through Porter. He knew what it was. A threat. A message. Thomas had been to the graveyard. He had desecrated the one sacred place Porter had left. Before he could react, the man was gone, melting back into the shadows of the alley. Porter's hand crushed the small toy. He looked at Tessa. He saw the terror in her eyes as she recognized the unspoken message. I know where your deepest pain is, and I can touch it whenever I want. Let's go home, Porter said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The fight had come, and he was ready. The ride back to the ranch was silent and tense. The desecrated toy sat on the wagon seat between them, a declaration of war. They both knew the time for waiting was over. Thomas Holloway had crossed a line from which there was no return. That night, for the first time, Porter didn't suggest Tessa take the master bedroom while he took the spare. The pretense of a marriage of convenience was gone, burned away by the heat of Thomas's threat. They were in this together, completely. He won't stop at threats, Tessa said, her voice shaking as she stared into the fireplace. He was showing you that nothing is sacred to him. He'll come for the baby. He'll have to come through me first, Porter said. He went to the master bedroom and came back with a shotgun. He laid it on the small table next to the rocking chair. Then he took the armchair opposite her. You should sleep in the bed, he told her. I'll keep watch. She looked at the shotgun, then at his grim, determined face. She didn't argue. But a few hours later, he awoke with a start to find she had brought a blanket and was curled up on the rug before the dying fire. She had wanted to be close to him, to the protector. The thought sent a strange, warm ache through his chest. The next day brought a new kind of terror. It was subtle, psychological. Porter went out to check the livestock and found the gate to the horse pasture wide open. His stallion, Old Red, was gone. Not stolen in a way that suggested rustlers, just gone, led away. A message. I can take what is yours whenever I please. He spent half the day tracking the horse, finally finding him miles away, thankfully unharmed. But the message was received. They were being watched, toyed with. The day after that, Tessa went to the well for water. She came running back, her face pale, her hand over her mouth. Porter ran to the well, a rifle in his hands. Lying at the bottom, floating in their water supply, was a dead coyote. Another message. I can poison you. I can starve you out. The war had begun, but it was a war of nerves. Thomas was trying to break them, to make them so terrified that they would give up the ledger just to make it stop. But he was misjudging his opponents. The fear didn't break them. It forged them. Every night, Porter sat watch. Every day they practiced shooting. Tessa's aim was getting better. The fierce, protective instinct of a mother-to-be was sharpening her senses, hardening her resolve. She was no longer the terrified girl from the storm. She was a woman defending her family. One afternoon, a rider approached the ranch. Not fast, not aggressive, just a slow, steady approach. Porter watched from the window, rifle in hand, while Tessa stood behind him with the pistol. It was Dr. Farley. Porter met him on the porch, his posture wary. The doctor was one of the few people in town who had shown them kindness, but in this new reality, everyone was a potential threat. Porter, the doctor said, his face etched with worry as he dismounted. I came to warn you. Warn us about what? Thomas Holloway. He's lost his mind. He was in town yesterday, drunk, bragging that he was going to burn you out. Said he was going to claim his property, the doctor said, glancing with concern toward the door where Tessa was undoubtedly listening. He's hired the rest of the Blackwood gang. They rode into town last night. They've taken over the saloon. The sheriff is either too scared or too drunk to do anything about it. The whole town is holding its breath. So the time for games was over. The siege was about to begin. Why are you telling me this, Doc? Porter asked, his eyes searching the older man's face. You're putting yourself at risk. Dr. Farley sighed, taking off his hat and wiping his brow. Because my wife and I are leaving. We're packing the wagon tonight. There's nothing left for us in Cypress Creek but Holloway's corruption. But before I go, Elizabeth was a dear friend of my wife. She wouldn't want me to stand by and watch her husband get himself killed. The doctor looked him straight in the eye. There's more. Something you should know about how Elizabeth died. Porter felt his blood run cold. What are you talking about? It was childbed fever. That's what I wrote on the certificate, Dr. Farley said, his voice low and pained. But it wasn't the whole truth. The fever was bad, yes, but she might have survived it. The reason it took hold so badly was because of a tonic she was taking, one Mrs. Holloway, Agatha, had recommended to her, for her nerves. Agatha Holloway, Porter whispered, his mind reeling. I tested what was left in the bottle later, the doctor continued, his voice full of shame. It was laced with small, steady doses of wolfsbane, not enough to kill her outright, but enough to weaken her system, to make her vulnerable, to ensure that a difficult birth would be a fatal one. The world tilted on its axis. The story he had told himself for 3 years, the tragedy he had blamed on fate and weather was a lie. Why? Porter choked out. Why would she do that? Because Elizabeth knew, the doctor said grimly. She worked with the church charity. She saw things, she heard things. She knew the Holloways were cheating people out of their land. She was starting to ask questions. Agatha was afraid she would expose them. She saw a way to silence her permanently. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a murder. The grief he had carried for 3 years was suddenly transformed into a white-hot, cleansing rage. He wasn't just fighting for Tessa and her unborn child anymore. He was fighting for Elizabeth, for the wife and son who had been stolen from him by the same corrupt, cancerous family that now sought to destroy everything he had left. Get out of here, Doc, Porter said, his voice deadly calm. Get your wife and ride as far and as fast as you can. Don't look back. The doctor nodded, his face full of pity. Be careful, Porter. They aren't just coming for a book. They're coming to bury a secret. As Dr. Farley rode away, Porter turned and went back inside. He looked at Tessa, who had heard everything. Her face was a pale mask of horror. He walked over to her and took the pistol from her trembling hands. He checked the load, then pressed it firmly back into her palm. This is it, he said. His eyes were no longer those of a sad, lonely rancher. They were the eyes of a soldier, an executioner. They took my first family. I'll be damned if they're going to take my second. That night, the moon was hidden by a thick blanket of clouds. The prairie was plunged into an inky, suffocating blackness. It was the kind of night that felt like it was holding its breath. Inside the small ranch house, there was no sleep. There was only waiting. Porter had barricaded the front door with a heavy oak table. He'd done the same to the back. He and Tessa moved through the darkened house like ghosts, checking the windows, listening for any sound that was out of place. The house, once a symbol of his grief and isolation, had become their final bastion. Tessa's time was near. He could see it in the way she moved, the way she would pause and press a hand to her lower back. A new fear, sharp and immediate, pierced through his rage. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. Not now. Maybe we should give it to them, Tessa whispered in the dark, her voice strained. The ledger. Maybe if they get what they want, they'll leave us alone. Porter moved to stand beside her at the front window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. You and I both know that's not true. That ledger is our death sentence as long as we're alive to talk about it. They aren't leaving any witnesses, Tessa. He reached out, his hand finding hers in the dark. We have one chance. We see this through. Together. Her fingers squeezed his, a silent promise. The first sign they were coming was the smell of smoke. Porter's head snapped up. He moved to the back of the house, to the kitchen window that overlooked the barn. In the distance, an orange glow was blooming against the black sky. The barn. They had set the barn on fire. It's a diversion, he hissed, pulling Tessa away from the window. They want me to run out there, to split us up. We stay here. We stay together. But the barn wasn't just a building. It was where the ledger was hidden. He saw the flash of panic in Tessa's eyes. Had they found it? Or were they just trying to destroy it, sight unseen? Then the first gunshot shattered the night. The bullet punched through the window where they had just been standing, spraying glass across the floor. They were here. Get down, Porter yelled, shoving Tessa toward the floor. He scrambled to the side of the window, his Winchester ready. Another shot, then another. They were firing at the house, peppering the walls with lead, trying to pin them down to intimidate them. "Stay here," Porter commanded Tessa, who was crouched behind the overturned table. "Don't move no matter what you hear." He crawled from the main room into the hallway, moving silently toward the back of the house. He knew every creak of these floorboards, every shadow. This was his home, his ground. He would make them pay for every inch of it. He could hear them outside, shouting to one another, their voices rough and ugly. He counted 3, maybe 4 different men, plus Thomas. From a side window, he saw a figure break from the darkness and run toward the house, a torch in his hand. He was going to try and set the house on fire. Porter raised the Winchester. He centered the sight on the running man's chest. He remembered the lessons of the war. Breathe out. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. Outside, the man with the torch screamed and fell, the torch sputtering out in the damp grass. A furious volley of shots answered him, splintering the window frame, chewing up the wall around him. He was pinned down. Suddenly, a cry from the main room, not of fear, of pain. "Tessa!" He scrambled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found her on the floor, her face contorted in agony. "The baby!" she gasped, her hands clutching her swollen belly. "Porter, it's coming, now." Of all the things he had planned for, this was not one of them. The siege was here, and their child was on its way. Panic, cold and absolute, threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't fight them and help her at the same time. They were trapped. "Okay," he said, forcing a calmness he did not feel into his voice. He grabbed blankets, pillows, piling them on the floor in the most protected corner of the room, away from the windows. "Okay, Tessa, just breathe, just like we talked about." But her face was ashen with more than just labor pains. "Porter," she panted, "when the glass broke, my leg, I think a piece. It's bleeding again." He looked down. A dark stain was spreading across her dress from the bandage on her thigh. The old wound had been reopened. They were out of time, and they were running out of chances. Outside, the shooting had stopped. The silence was even more terrifying. He knew what they were doing. They were regrouping, planning their next move. Then a voice called out from the darkness. It was Thomas Holloway. "Ingram, I know you're in there. I have a new offer for you." Porter crawled to the shattered front window, keeping low. "I'm not interested in your offers, Holloway." "Oh, I think you'll be interested in this one." Thomas's voice was giddy, unhinged. "Send out my bride-to-be in the ledger, and I'll let you live. I'll even let you watch as I cut my child out of her. A fair trade, don't you think?" Porter's rage was so pure, so absolute, it was almost clarifying. He was dealing with a monster. "You'll get neither," he yelled back. "Wrong answer," Thomas shrieked. A new sound joined the night, the sickening, wet sound of something being poured against the side of the house. Kerosene. They were going to burn them out, burn them alive. He looked back at Tessa. Her face was slick with sweat, her eyes rolling back in pain. She was losing blood. The baby was coming, and the walls of their home were about to be consumed by fire. This was how it ended. Trapped, surrounded, no way out. He remembered Elizabeth. He remembered the promise he had made to Tessa. He would not fail again. There had to be a way. He scanned the room, his mind racing, searching for an answer, for a miracle. His eyes fell on the fireplace. The flames had died down to glowing embers. It was a brick chimney, sturdy, built to last. And it led up. It led out. "Tessa," he said, his voice urgent. He crawled to her side. "Listen to me. They're going to set the house on fire. We have to move. Now." He explained his desperate, insane plan. The old root cellar. The entrance was outside, a pair of slanted doors at the back of the house. But there was another way in, a small access hatch used for cleaning at the back of the fireplace, behind the iron fireback. It was small. It would be a tight fit. But it might be possible. "I'll go first," he said. "Clear the way. Then I'll come back for you." He didn't wait for an answer. He kicked the smoldering logs aside, pulled at the heavy iron plate. It came loose with a groan of rusted metal, revealing a small, black opening. Soot and ash cascaded out. He grabbed his revolver and a box of cartridges. "Keep shooting if you can," he told Tessa. "Make them think we're still here." He squeezed through the opening into the chimney flue. It was claustrophobic, choked with soot. He shimmied his way down into the ash pit at the base of the chimney, then found the small wooden hatch that led into the crawl space beneath the house. He crawled on his belly through dirt and cobwebs, moving toward the back of the house, toward the foundation of the root cellar. Above him, he heard a shout, then the whoosh of the fire catching. He could smell the smoke, hear the roar as the flames began to lick up the wooden walls of his home. He found the cellar's stone foundation, the small opening for ventilation. He kicked at it, the old mortar crumbling. He squeezed through into the cool, damp darkness of the cellar. He was out, but Tessa was still inside the burning house. He burst out of the cellar doors, gun in hand, emerging into a nightmare. The whole front of the house was engulfed in flames. The Blackwood gang was dancing and cheering, their faces lit by the hellish orange glow. Thomas Holloway stood watching, a look of insane triumph on his face. They didn't see him. All their attention was on the fire. He had the element of surprise. But it was him against at least 5 of them. The odds were impossible. Then he saw it. Stacked near the burned-out shell of the barn were the crates of dynamite he used for clearing stumps. He'd forgotten all about them in the chaos. A new plan, even more desperate and insane than the last, formed in his mind. He crept toward the woodpile, grabbing a burning log. He ran, silent as a shadow, toward the crates. He lit the long fuse on a stick of dynamite. He didn't have a plan for what came next. This was for Elizabeth. This was for Tessa. "Holloway!" he roared. Thomas spun around, his face a mask of disbelief. The other men turned, raising their rifles. Porter didn't wait. He threw the lit stick of dynamite not at the men, but at the crates. He dove behind a watering trough just as the world erupted. The explosion was immense, a deafening cataclysm of fire and force that threw him against the trough, stunning him. Splinters and debris rained down from the sky. When his hearing returned, it was to a scene of absolute carnage. 2 of the outlaws were just gone. Another lay on the ground, screaming. Thomas and 1 other man had been thrown back by the blast but were scrambling to their feet, dazed and confused. Porter rose, the Winchester in his hands. He was no longer a farmer. He was the angel of death. He shot the remaining outlaw cleanly through the chest. The man crumpled without a sound, and then it was just him and Thomas. Thomas Holloway stared at him, his fine clothes torn, his face blackened with soot. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by raw animal fear. He raised his pistol, his hand shaking. "She's mine!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "She was never yours," Porter said, advancing on him, the rifle steady in his hands. Thomas fired. The shot went wide. He tried to fire again, but his gun clicked on an empty chamber. He had wasted his bullets on the house. Porter kept walking toward him. He didn't fire. He wanted Thomas to see him coming, to understand the mistake he had made. Thomas threw the empty gun at him and turned to run. Porter was faster. He tackled him, sending them both sprawling to the ground. They rolled in the dirt, fists flying. Thomas was younger, but Porter was fueled by years of grief and a moment of pure, righteous fury. He slammed Thomas's head against the ground, once, twice. He drew his hunting knife from his belt. He held it to Thomas's throat. "This is for Elizabeth," he snarled. From the burning house, a single gunshot rang out. Porter froze. Tessa. Thomas saw his hesitation. He kicked out, catching Porter in the ribs. He scrambled away, crab walking backward in the dirt, his eyes wild with terror. "The ledger!" he shrieked. "Where is it?" Suddenly, a figure emerged from the cellar doors. It was Tessa. She was covered in soot, clutching her belly with one hand. But in the other, she held Porter's army Colt. Her arm was extended, steady, the barrel smoking. She had shot the outlaw he had wounded, the man who had been crawling toward him. "It's gone," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her pain. It burned, with everything else. Thomas stared from her to the burning house, his mind collapsing. The ledger, his power, his protection, was gone, turned to ash. He let out a wordless scream of frustration and lunged at Tessa. Porter's rifle fired. The shot was clean, precise. Thomas Holloway fell face first into the dirt, his reign of terror over. Silence descended, broken only by the roar of the fire and Tessa's sharp gasp of pain. Porter ran to her as she collapsed. He caught her, lowering her gently to the ground. The fire lit the scene in a macabre glow. His home was gone. The barn was gone. The outlaws were dead. But Tessa was alive, and their baby was still coming. "It's okay," he whispered, cradling her head in his lap, trying to shield her from the sight of the carnage around them. "It's over. We're safe now." He tore strips from his shirt, desperately trying to bind her wounded leg to stop the bleeding. Her labor was coming faster now, her cries sharp and urgent. He was alone. No doctor, no shelter. Just a dying fire and a woman giving birth in the middle of a battlefield. He delivered his daughter there, in the dirt and the dark, with the ruins of his past life burning behind them. He cleaned her with water from the trough and wrapped her in the cleanest part of his soot-stained shirt. She was small, perfect, and she let out a lusty cry that defied the destruction around her. He placed the baby in Tessa's arms. She was weak, pale from blood loss, but she smiled, a radiant, tear-streaked smile. "Elizabeth," she whispered. "Let's call her Elizabeth." Porter looked at his new daughter, his wife, his family. They had survived. They had won. As the sun began to rise, casting a clean, hopeful light over the ravaged landscape, he saw a lone rider approaching. It wasn't a threat. It was a man in a uniform, a U.S. Marshal, likely drawn by the sound of the explosion. Justice had arrived. The Marshal listened to their story, his eyes taking in the scene. The dead outlaws, the burned-out ranch, the newborn baby. He found what was left of the ledger in the barn, charred but not completely destroyed. Enough was left to confirm the story, to bring down the whole rotten structure of the Holloway Empire. Cypress Creek was cleansed. The reign of the Holloways was over. Porter and Tessa rebuilt. They used the money from the cash box, the money Tessa had taken to save her own life, to build a new house, stronger than the last. The town, free from the Holloway's grip, helped. They had a new respect for the quiet widower and his fierce, brave wife. They had forged a family not out of convenience, but out of fire and blood and a shared will to survive. They had faced down monsters and won. And in the quiet moments, as they watched their daughter sleep, they found something they never expected to find in the ashes of their old lives. They found love. A love that was stronger than any storm, fiercer than any fire. A love born on the wild Wyoming frontier, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones you have to fight for. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice on the frontier, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Let us know in the comments what you would have done if you were in Porter's shoes. Thanks for watching.